there's a lot of failures along the way in terms of my own art making because of experimentation, because of like reinventing the wheel each time. And with experimenting, I would imagine with film, you'd also have, more failures. But when you hit on something that's really juicy and compelling, it can be really satisfying. At least that's my experience with art making. But the number of failures required to get there is also quite something.
It's breathtaking.
This is Way of the Artist with Brandon Colby Cook and Evan Schulte.
Identifying your blocks and demystifying your struggles
so that you can claim your own path
and make your life a work of art.
Hello, folks. We have a guest today, Leah Weinstein, and she is a sculptor, an animator, and illustrator. She is one of the most diverse artists that I have ever met in my life. It blows me away. Just the way that she thinks and how creative she is and how her mind works around art. And I'm super excited to introduce her. I'm super excited to bring her into this conversation, especially because of what we talk about. And Leah, you work on a level that I'm just blown away by. I'm fascinated by, and I'm just excited to have you. I don't know what else to say, but welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thanks, Evan. I'm so happy to be here. I've listened to your podcast, and yeah, I'm really excited to dive in with you guys. I haven't met Evan yet, so it's great to be here with both of you guys.
Well, thanks for coming on. So I mean, I guess I don't know, like, let's just launch off with a question. Like, what inspires you to like get up and like create and just like do the work that you do?
All right. Great question. So yeah, art making has been a part of my identity, I would say, since I was a child. So there's a sense that it's something that I need to do in order to express myself or as a way of communicating. And sometimes I stumble with words, as you will discover through this interview, but there's a clarity that can happen through object making that I find really compelling. So it's a form of expression that has been, part of my life for a really long time.
Yeah, I think that's like such a good point, because there are artists out there and they don't know how to use words necessarily to express themselves. Like that's not really where they do it. But like through sculpting and through things like that, you find your voice and I mean, it's interesting. You're on a podcast and you're going to try and talk about this art that you do, and I could imagine that's going to be difficult in certain ways. But like, I get that. I think that's an important element,
it's like that old Zen saying or Buddhist saying where it's like, it's pointing to the moon, right? Yeah. It's like you try and talk about these things and it's like talking about it isn't really the thing, but we can try and direct it in some way. I mean, Brandon like just comes out laying down the gauntlet with a huge question and saying like, hey, articulate the like thing that's like not you, that's like impossible to articulate.
Yeah.
It's great though. It's such a great opportunity to dig deeper into some of those questions that I take for granted maybe. So articulating them and having the opportunity to articulate them is a really great way to share that and even to describe. I could describe some of the works at some point maybe so that you can imagine the shape of them and how that relates to what we're talking about.
Yeah, I would love that. I mean, you've also taught art to other people as well. I don't know if you're still doing that, but like, how did that go? How did the teaching process of sharing these things with people go?
Yeah, so I've been teaching for the past 2 years, mainly full-time, almost full-time. And I'm teaching technical skills of drawing mostly and color theory and garment construction. So So talking about the process of making a drawing or a seam or button or zipper sample, things like that, I find that is a lot different than digging into the deeper ideas underneath the sculpture that I make as my art practice. But it's such a wonderful way to learn those fundamentals at a deeper level as I teach them to other students. Yeah.
So there's so when you're teaching, you're finding like the curriculum is probably around like technical stuff, like teaching people how to technically do certain things artistically. But then there's the whole deeper element, which is like the artistry of the art, which is kind of what we're going to try to get into. And that's the hardest part to talk about. I think like sometimes people listen to this type of stuff and they're like, oh, okay, I'm going to get the answer. I want the way. And it's like, well, there isn't really a way. It's kind of something you have to dig in to find yourself and to articulate that. I think people sometimes they want a straight answer, but it's like, this isn't a straight answer. This is like an unraveling, I think, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's something I think we're all discovering a little bit as we go, and we're trying to articulate it, and we have our own way of doing our artistry.
Yeah, I guess it relates also to the parallel of art and design. And I feel like what I'm teaching are design principles that are more related to the structure of a composition versus, for me, what personally I relate to art as being these deeper questions that perhaps we've carried our whole lives and are still reshaping the question over and over again in each work, and that somehow that thread can be traced back throughout the entire body of work. And so that art question relates, I think, to something very personal for each artist. And a design process relates more to, I think, how to communicate in that visual medium or that visual language. So it's like the design process that I'm teaching, or the technical process of teaching, relates to learning the language, and then the art making is more like what you do with that language, I guess, kind of.
I get that.
Like giving yourself like essentially like the linguistics of your medium to try and bring that to your expression to its fullest possibility, I guess, right? Which, is like, I would guess, like, do you find that, like, because you are obviously like, it's almost embarrassing how many different things that you do and that you can teach people, and that, like, I would love to just know how you learned how to just do all of these different things. But I guess what I want to get into first is, do you find that even with like all of your skills that you have, that, like, do you have works that you put out there and you just go, it's like, yes, this was exactly what I wanted to communicate in this work? Or is it a constant, or is it like a thing of like, because I before I put my shit into this, like, I just want to hear your response.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think there's with a work that I think is making, and I can describe a couple of them as well. Maybe that will be that will help this attempt to articulate artwork, which so there are a few works that there's this excitement in the process of making, where there's a feeling of like, yes, this gets at something that I'm interested in. But I always find at some point when it's complete, there's always a sense of, oh, okay, this could be improved, or that could be improved. So it's in a way, there's a moment in making each artwork where there's a feeling of, yes, this is getting at that thing, that question of for me is form and shape. So a lot of, because I work in materials, a lot of what I'm interested in is how shapes of materials, soft materials, mostly textile, and some metal and some ready-made, so bringing found objects in and using found shapes, how these shapes relate to bodies. So some of them are wearable sculptures, or kind of portable shelters. So maybe I'll just describe one of those works where there was something in it that was a yes, but it still could be improved upon. It could still be remade, and that is a very early work that I made actually in the early 2000s. That is a sculpture for 5 people to wear. So it looks like a tent, and it has 5 bodices coming out of the top of the tent, and it's has a zipper so you can enter as if you would enter a tent. And then once you're inside this, it looks like a white dome, like a white tent. Once you're inside this form, you can stand up through one of these 5 bodices. So this piece was exhibited and then performed. And so myself and 4 of my friends wore the sculpture from the gallery exhibition, and we walked from Granville Island. It was actually the grad show, my grad show of the undergrad program I did. So we walked along the seawall, negotiating how do we make decisions as a group in this non-hierarchical way, because these 5 bodices are equal, and there isn't, like, we took turns kind of leading and turning this in this sculpture. Someone had to walk backwards, or we could turn around and someone had to walk sideways. So it was this awkward negotiation of 5 people in a sculpture. So I think when that work has been repeated in different shapes and forms in all of my subsequent works, not all of them, but some of them. But so the interest in how does this form, which in that case took the shape of a tent dress, shape and influence our social interactions, and how do we work together as a collective, and the kind of failure inherent in that, and the kind of utopian ideal in that, by which I mean, like the ideal. It's all I thought of it later as like a learning tool for working together, and then does it need to be performed, or can we just look at it and imagine the performance? And that's been kind of an ongoing question in my work. Does it need to have performers, or can we just look at it and imagine that performance?
See, that's an example of like how your work just blows me away, because the way that you think, the way that you would put that together is just so far, it's just so far away from like what I would think to do. You know what I mean? And I just find that fascinating, because it's like, I think sometimes for a lot of artists, and maybe people can relate to me, I look at art, and I've been taught to look at art like it needs to be almost functional, like, but that limits my ability to be able to sometimes let myself think outside the box, because that is my box. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I think a lot of people struggle with that as artists. Like, they're like, well, what's the point? And it's like, well, that's the thing, is like, if you're not willing to expand outside of what you think, or what you think your limits are, you'll never know. You'll never even try, So I just find that incredible. And what I'm most curious about is like, how did you do that? Like, how do you get to the idea where you let go of those things, or would they never put on you? Like, what happened?
Well, yeah, those are great questions. So I totally have that. I grapple with that question of function. What is the function of art? Should it fit into daily life? How does it fit into daily life? How is it used? Should it be used? Is it, art for just the purpose of contemplation? What is the function of that? And so I definitely think about these things. And but then coming back to your question of how did I start out on that, I guess, decision to even ask those questions, I think came from early experiences. I think someone was asking me recently, like, when did you decide to be an artist? And for me, it was in grade 4 when I had a teacher, Mr. Dazuba, who gave us a drawing assignment. And Mr. Dazuba never gave anyone an A on drawing assignments. It was a known fact, or at least in my 9-year-old mind, that was the way it was. And I did a drawing of a landscape, a stream, and plants and rocks, and water falling over these rocks. It was just like a drawing. It was from looking at nature. I grew up on the island in like hippie parents, back to the land kind of hand-built house, forest dwelling, childhood. So when Mr. Dazuba gave me an A on that drawing, I decided, I'm an artist, according to Mr. Dazuba. So that must be great. And I was encouraged to draw and to consider myself that. Other people, adults in my life, valued art, and I think my mother in particular valued art. And so to me, I got the message that was a worthwhile pursuit. Later, I thought of it as a curse, like it's a terrible thing to encourage your child to pursue art because it's like, So yeah, it's like a gift to encourage a child to, I'm always amazed when I hear of how many people are discouraged as children to make art. And that totally impacts their whole, experience of having agency or identifying themselves as an artist. And so I was given permission at a young age to kind of have the identity of an artist. And so I just that's something I took for granted. And there's lots of other things I would love to have been given permission to, to be that I necessarily, so that was one gift that I received, and also like a challenge, because I didn't consider any other path.
Right. How do you, because like I was like looking through, because like we're just meeting for the first time, and I was looking through your website, looking at your works and just like taking them all in. And like Brandon in some ways kind of touched on this, but for myself, it's like when I look at like kind of the type of work that you do, being someone who comes from a performing arts background in like acting, as well as like doing music and things like I look at the stuff you do and I go, well, that's an artist, because like for me, it's like I see so much of the stuff that I've pursued as almost being like a mainstream and even a commoditized art form to a very large degree. When I look at this kind of stuff you do, and like definitely where you begin with drawing, and I'm sure other different forms of like illustration, that would be something that's more conventional, but there's stuff that is so decidedly unconventional about a lot of the work that you do now. Where does that jump happen for you in your life? Like,
yeah. Okay. Great question. Okay. Well, I think a lot of it was my education at Emily Carr and really being, again, it's about kind of being given permission, or in some cases deciding it was a worthwhile inquiry, to really explore like what is at the heart of my interest. And as I identified, I think one of the core interests I have as a human is like presence, being present with others, being in a body, and being alive and present, and being relating to others. So just like a really core human experience. And so through study and permission and feedback in art school and beyond, and later beyond, thinking through making drawings of sculptures, making drawings of shapes that could facilitate presence and social interactions, and a kind of a reminder that we're in bodies, and a physical kind of experience of being in a space. So these are things that just interest me as a human. And so a lot of the works that you might see on my website are meant to be a container for people to interact. So for example, there's a chess set, like a 12, I think it was actually 16 feet by 16 feet chess set that I made in a artist residency for the Dunbar Community Center a couple of years ago, 4 years ago. And it's a 16 by 16 square where the sod is left on one part of the checkerboard, and then the sod is cut out and replaced by wool rugs and grass mats, materials that will decompose. So they're meant to kind of slowly disintegrate back into the landscape. So there's this chess set made by removing some of the sod and replacing it with rugs. And then the chess pieces were made with beech logs that I was given permission from Vancouver Parks, because the residency was related to Vancouver, was funded by the City of Vancouver and Vancouver Parks, to use found beech wood and cut it into these shapes of chess pieces. And then one half of the chess pieces had carpet nailed to the top so you could identify. And then it was just left in the field at Memorial Park at Dunbar Community Center for passers-by to encounter and engage with. So maybe that's a good example of thinking about how these shapes can cause an interaction, a social interaction, and also relate art making to the game and strategy and that kind of thing.
I'm starting to see a little bit about your process. It's like there's something that you do as an artist, which maybe you're not even aware of, I don't know, but it challenges certain things about social norms, because like I think in our culture, there's this whole thing that goes on about like, what's the point? And if I'm not building myself, or if I'm not getting somewhere, if I'm not accomplishing something or making some legacy or something, that somehow I'm not winning at life, And there's this whole other kind of idea of like being present, because the only thing that actually exists is right now. Like right now is the moment, right? And like, I think sometimes we can get so caught in the past and the future and the point and the purpose of trying to make something or control it, that that is actually a limit. And like you taking your value of being like presence and social interaction and using that to inform your art has actually made you kind of break through some of the barriers that I think a lot of us feel stuck in. And that's not just in life. I mean, that's in art. I mean, that's in life too. That's like, I think we're all caught in that a lot, like we get wrapped up in these social ideas of how we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to think.
Yeah. Well, I totally get caught up in that too. And we're looking at, I'm sharing with you my website of what I call like my work in quotation, or my capital A art. But the majority of what I do are projects for others that are more based on like a function, as you say, or costume design. I do a lot of costumes for other artists or theater or dance. So most of what I actually make are these more practical things that have a specific place to live. So I totally get caught up in that too. Like I need to make a living, and I can't do that easily with some of these, ephemeral artworks or a shelter form that I can't store that forever. So a lot of them are gone and they just exist in photographs. Some of them are sold, a couple pieces sold, but most of them were temporary and just not sustainable in the long term. So finding a way So the art is this ideal goal, but the practicality of doing that on an ongoing basis is really super challenging.
Right. But
so, yeah.
the ideal that you have, the fact that you actually go to that realm, which I'm going to say, like, for myself, I don't do that enough. And part of the thing that inspires me about you is that you do, and you get to venture into an area that, like, I don't really see as much as I'd like to. But that when you go somewhere that most people won't go, you can come back with new information, with new ideas. Like, when you don't even go there, you never know. You don't know what's out there. Like, if people say, don't go into the woods, it's scary. You never know. You just never know what's out there. But, like, people might go, you could go out to the woods and it's pointless, but you go out to the woods and you might bring nothing back except your experience. And your experience is the gift. It is the reward, right? So, like, when I hear you talk about that, I'm like, yeah, but it's the experience of doing it that you come back to do practical stuff or functional stuff, right? You have information or ideas or experiences that other people just wouldn't have.
Yeah, that's really true. But if I didn't go and create those things, I wouldn't be able to share them, because no one else is going to ask me to make that shelter form, that strange bubble, or whatever this form is that is impractical and cumbersome. No one else is going to commission me to do that work. So I think that's a really good point. So it's necessary to go out, to venture into the wilderness, as you say, and see what's there. And it's also really challenging to do that, just in terms of living in Vancouver and the practicalities, not to mention this strange time we live in now with, being limited to our homes in most cases. But yeah. I lost my train of thought. I don't know.
That's all right.
That's okay.
Yeah.
It happens.
I wanted to come back to something that you had said, like, you're talking about that first piece that you did, where everybody's in this shared sort of dome and collectively. And you said that looking back, that piece has, like, sort of informed or been a recurring theme in your following works. Is that something that was intentional, or something that you've just, like, observed in hindsight that is, like, this thing that continues to come out?
That's something that I've observed in hindsight. As the starting point for a lot of my work is drawing, and that sort of shape recurs. And so through drawing different forms, I've noticed over time when the looking back at some of the works, like, for example, I have a couple of sculptures that include multiple sleeves. Like, for example, one piece is a wall sculpture, and it has, I think, 50 sleeves and a zipper on each end, and hooks so that it can be removed from the wall and worn. And the idea, or hopefully it occurs to the performers or participants, that the zipper on either end connects. And so if you can attempt to zip up this garment, then you're all trapped in this multi-person garment. So that relation to the earlier work, I guess I was aware of it as I was making it, but how closely related it was something that I saw later. Or the question, because the question feels consistent, then the shape it takes seems to be related. Another work, and Brandon, you visited the school bus gallery that I ran for a few years. For 2.5 years, I ran a school bus gallery where I had a 72 passenger school bus that I bought for converting to a studio. And I used it for a studio for about 5 years. It's an awesome space to have a studio. And keep in mind that I grew up with hippie parents on the island, so it was normal to have a school bus on the property. In fact, my parents had a school bus that I lived in for a couple of summers when I was doing work on Quadra Island and Cortez Island. So for me, it was, you get a school bus, you convert it, and then you use it as this mobile space. So I had a school bus, and then it occurred to me after some time that this was an awesome container in which to invite people in to work together, in the same way that that early sculpture of the dress was a container to invite people in to have an interaction. And so that was something I kind of connected the dots later after I'd been using the school bus as a studio. So after about 5 years, I realized, hey, this would be a really great social sculpture to invite other artists to bring artwork in. So it became a curatorial project and share their work, and we can move it to a different site each time. And then there's so much independence and agency that artists have to shape the experience of the viewer. So, if I want it to be in a parking lot as a visiting artist, so if the visiting artist wanted to be in a parking lot or a beach or outside of a gallery or whatever, there was a lot of more control, I guess. So that I looked at in hindsight and saw the connection, but I was also aware of that relation as I was going through the process too. So maybe a bit of both.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, it sounds as though too, like with a lot of your work, particularly like some of these things that like people can wear, or is like, and that people don't necessarily have to. It strikes me that there's an aspect of you perhaps intentionally challenging your audience, challenging the person who's observing it. Is that something that you have built in? Is that something you want to do for people who see your work?
Yeah, that's I really want it to be an invitation, and I'm aware that some people won't take on that invitation. Like another artwork I did as a public artwork for the city of Richmond was this 10-piece shelter form. So so the whole thing looks like, I think it was 7 feet high and 9 feet in diameter, and the whole thing is shaped like a bubble that sits on the ground in 10 slices that tie together and have magnets to also keep the whole thing contained as a kind of like it actually looked a little bit like a moon shell, because there's an opening as well. So there's this opening for people to enter. And so I hired dancer performers to carry these individual slices across these 3 different sites, and then construct this bubble dome kind of moon shell form, very utopian looking kind of bubble in this planned destination, and then invite viewers in by placing these pieces of, different shaped pieces of welcome mats, like grass mats that were already set up at the site, placing them like stepping stones to invite, in a nonverbal way, to invite viewers to enter. And some people entered, but there's definitely, there's always some reluctance to engage, because then all of a sudden you don't know what's going to happen. Maybe there'll be some expectation of you once you enter the sculpture, but there wasn't. But finding a way to invite people in, but also somehow communicate that there isn't any particular expectation of them. They don't have to perform. They just have to be there. Mm-hmm.
Like an invitation to play, really. Yeah. That's so fascinating, because there's I come up against that with for myself when there's something going on around me, and I'll just be like, oh no, like, I'm just going to stand here and not participate. But, it's a fascinating thing. So it's like I said, at the beginning of the question was like, are you trying to challenge people? But in some ways, like, it's almost an invitation to come and play. As like not being like,
not a challenge, more an invitation to play. I think that's a good way to put it. It's like, because it does challenge you, but it's not intended to challenge you. It's intended to give you like an opportunity that you wouldn't see there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I definitely think of it more as an invitation than a challenge, but also another part of what I've noticed in my work over time is there's definitely a childlike quality. Like I think a lot of my work comes from that more innocent or even naive place. And so I started to notice over time, especially with that piece in Richmond, kind of a naivete by inviting people into this bubble that like, what does that represent anyway? And what is the benefit of that? What is the benefit of that experience? And although there were some really magical moments, like in a storm came up in our third performance in Terra Nova Park and kind of was like blowing these pieces, and everyone was huddled inside, and it was raining, and we had these it was really kind of dramatic, but the innocence and naivete is something I've also been grappling with, which has sort of led me to look into the utopian idea, the utopian ideal, and the sort of the innocence in that, and also the dystopian underbelly that's inevitable. So, so like the invitation is presented, and then the challenge is maybe discovered through the process. And the challenge isn't always clear, but then with that, after that Richmond project, I really started to think more about, okay, what is this ideal I'm trying to present, this kind of like shared presence? It seems very kind of naive in a way. So I started exploring objects that meant to offer solutions, but in fact were more cumbersome. So the inevitable failure of this very earnest solution. So an example of that is this lampshade vest, which is a metal armature that goes under a vest, and a lamp which extends out from the shoulder and then has a pull chain for turning the light on and off. It had a battery pack in the back of the vest, and how like it's meant to be really useful and helpful and kind of offer something really useful, but actually it's totally impractical and cumbersome. So like the problem that's created by a solution it's meant to be, like, it's offered in earnestness, but it's actually can be problematic. And so that became kind of a topic over the next kind of few works of like the inevitable failure of this kind of utopian solution, I guess. Yeah.
There's like it's interesting because there's like the intention, with art. Like there's I think that's a really important element of art that people don't talk about very much, but art requires intention. When it's unintentional, when people just kind of go like, I think people will like this. Like it's not like, it has no point, right? It's other than to try and please or something like that. I think that's kind of like the lowest form of art, right? But like when you kind of come up with an intention, like I'm going to do this for this reason, or I'm going to try this, or I'm going to follow this thing. And intention can lead you to all sorts of interesting discoveries. And part of the art is the discovery of where that intention leads you. And where that leads you next is kind of where the art kind of bridges, right? Like it carries you to there so that you can see something you couldn't see, even if you can see something that doesn't work, right? Or something that, I don't know, like, I think like that's part of learning art, right? Like to really learn art or to be an artist is being willing to try something that you don't know where it'll lead you to, so that you can see what it looks like when you get there. Not because that's the victory, but because that point that you get to is a new perspective that you can see as valuable? Like that seems a lot like how you work. You get yourself to a point of perspective where you can ask a new question.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Yeah, I think at its best, it does that. But it's so easy to fall into a trap, which I have also many, many times, of making something that is aesthetically pleasing for others, that wasn't ultimately, taking me or the viewer to a new place at which to kind of look back and have a new vantage point to look at things, but rather was just kind of, and there's nothing wrong with a purely aesthetic exploration. I think that's a totally valid inquiry. And sometimes I wish I had more of that because I could be more commercially viable. That was my goal. But sculpture inevitably relates to the body. At least that's how I see it. So yeah, where was I going with that? Yeah, I got lost there. Yeah.
Well, we were just talking about like having the intention of something behind a work, and I don't know if that sparks whatever it was.
Yeah, the intention. Yeah, so if the intention is to create a social experience, then hopefully that occurs. And if the intention is to create more of a visually aesthetic experience, hopefully that intention occurs, although I haven't made that my intention. I went on a tangent.
I think what I see is like, because for me, like I have to be honest, like part of having you on the podcast is I want to have people hear how you think. That's important to me, but also this is a inquiry for me. It's an opportunity for me to try to understand how you work and how you do what you do. Because for the audience out there, they haven't necessarily experienced you and experienced your work, but I have, and I find it quite fascinating. But what I'm deciphering from everything is like, it's an experimental process for you, because you try something and you get a result, and that result might be something you didn't expect. And your experiment comes from a place of like innocence and maybe naivety of like, I don't know, like, let's see. And maybe you expect it to work a certain way, and then all of a sudden it doesn't. And you're like, okay, now I am more aware of this. And so then it opens up a new experiment, and your art kind of becomes experimental. And I'm just kind of thinking about that in terms of like my own idea. Like as we've been talking, my creative brain has been just firing, and I'm like, oh, I could do something this way. And it's just making me think like, what if I tried that? And that's kind of like, I'm trying to try on your process and see how I can incorporate that into my own artist, modality. Right. But yeah, like, it seems like a lot of this is an experiment. It's let's try that. But at the same time, you're also hitting some other values that you have.
Yeah, it is absolutely experimental. And that's why a lot of the works that I make look totally different from one another. And I hope over time, the thread of the inquiry is visible throughout them. But it's not immediately obvious, that's for sure. I think it takes some digging to see the thread, because they look totally different. The school bus, the knit painting made by multiple people as a collective social fabric experiment, the chess set, these different sculptures, they look quite different. And even the mediums that I use vary off, across a really wide spectrum. So the risk of being so experimental is that it's hard for people to see the thread throughout your work. And there is a commercial expectation to have a really recognizable visual style, whereas that's not visually apparent in a lot of my works. I think it's more of a conceptual thread. So, but I think the willingness to experiment can make the work more gratifying, if not practical, because it's not practical, but it can be it can be more interesting, I think, for the one who's making the work. So yeah, I think it's all about,
I mean, I think that's part of like the way as an artist is like, part of it is you're trying to accomplish something. You're trying to create some art, maybe. I mean, I think you're trying to create some art so other people can experience it and express yourself. But then there's this other part is you're trying to express yourself. And I think that sometimes with the demands of culture and society of like, you need to make money, you need to get somewhere, you need to accomplish something, you need to make a name for yourself. We sometimes forget about the part that's our own gratification of the art, right? Like, I mean, I think that is an important element. I think that's an important element because that personal gratification of the art is what maybe leads you to be more practical and, I don't know, just functional, like figure out, okay, well, like I enjoy doing this and I'm finding a way to do that. But like through those discoveries, I'm learning something that people can connect with and that can be incorporated into my enjoyment, as opposed to like, I'm going to do what other people want and then try to enjoy that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, because I think that's what a lot of people do. They're like, I'm going to do what people want, or I'm going to create something in this realm that people approve of, and then I'm going to try to enjoy that. But I think that's sometimes a backwards way of looking at art. It's a very like commercial and practical way, but like, I think it backfires. I see it backfire in screenwriting all the time. I just know that, you know?
Yeah, I think that's true. And if the work goes at the heart of some question you have or I have as an artist, then it's going to be more meaningful. And yeah, maybe just being more meaningful is satisfying. So if it has more meaning to me and I can share that with others, and some people, not everyone is going to respond to it, but if some others can respond to it as well, then it can be really satisfying. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, isn't that the point? I mean, like with art is that you gotta enjoy to some degree being artistic, being creative. Like, I mean,
yeah. Otherwise, why?
If you're hating it, right? If you're hating your creative side and you're not making money at it and you're hating it, like that's just a disaster, right? Like, I've been an artist and not made money, but I love doing my art at least.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. It has to be a compelling question or process. You know, a lot of, I think also, because I also make quilts, as a kind of a side practice to my art. I don't necessarily call them art objects, but I make quilts mostly for the delight in making, like enjoying the process of fabric and color and constructing and sewing and that whole process of piecing them together. And then they easily live in the world, so that kind of makes it easier to sort of justify them because they can find a home easily in the world being a functional object. But the enjoyment in the process is, I think, a really key part, because then you're enjoying the moment, and then you're enjoying kind of your own presence while you're making. And then you keep doing it. And if it's not enjoyable, then why would you continue? It's already challenging to be an artist. Why would you? Yeah, exactly. Why would you keep doing it if you don't enjoy the process?
You know, Evan, actually, now that she said that, I actually kind of wanted to turn it to you, because you're so much about presence and in acting. I mean, how does that relate to acting? Like, just because you're trying to do all this stuff as an actor, right? You're trying to have a career and get your headshots and have an agent and all that, figure out the technical craft of acting. But then in the meantime, like, there's the presence, like, especially with your Meisner training, like, that's what Evan does. He trains people in this Meisner process. And it's like that moment, right? Those moments become the most important thing in your entire career. And it's all in that moment, you know, and you don't realize that because you're so focused on some of this stuff, but like, what are your thoughts on that? I'm just curious.
I mean, no, I'm at a loss for it. I mean, like, really, because it is funny because there's all of this shit that swirls around the thing that you do, but really bringing it back down, distilling everything down to the fact that it's like, well, but really your work still comes down to this interaction, this relationship, this discovery of whatever this thing is that's going on right now. And for me, it's always about like trying to shift the perspective of actors that it's like that you're in this to be in a constant state of discovery, of coming in with a sense of, I guess, innocence, of being like, I don't know what this actually is right now. I know what I'm coming in with, but this other person is going to kind of tell me what happens next. And I mean, I think that translates into other art forms, in acting, it just happens to be, it's like, okay, you have a specific person, usually, that your things are coming back at you from. But I've watched, I got really, during this whole lockdown, I binged through this show called Portrait Artist of the Year. It's like this British show, and it's like, and it's fantastic. They bring in all these different artists to they're all vying for this, to get this grant, basically get to this commission to do a portrait. And they all have their different styles. And it was fascinating to watch them just in such focus with their canvas, whatever that was. But I was still watching, I was like, this is like acting, except their canvas and the paint or the whatever is telling them, is giving them their feedback, and they're having to respond, be like, oh geez, if I do more, I could destroy this whole thing. But at the same time, it feels incomplete. And it's like, there is this whole listening, attentive process with an abstraction, so to speak.
Yeah. Wow. That's fascinating. Being that process in acting, which I'm not familiar with, although I did take an improv class. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. And that was just to get comfortable with teaching. But being present and responding to what's immediately in front of you, rather than the preconceived idea of what that person will say or what that image is going to look like. Mm-hmm. I can relate that to drawing, and when drawing from life, when looking closely at life, for example, a face, a portrait, a model, a life model, and this is what I tell my students and what I do myself, is to just notice what you see and draw the shapes as you see them, rather than what you think a body looks like or what you think a face looks like, because you'll get it wrong if you draw from your idea of it rather than what you're actually experiencing in front of you. And I imagine that might be true with acting. If you're responding to what you think the other actor will say, you're not going to be present and authentic, I would imagine, in a similar way.
Yeah, it's the idea is that you're responding with what you think is happening as opposed to what is actually happening. And then, for acting teachers of mine in the past, and I guess I say this too, but then what you're doing is it's going to be contrived no matter what. What's coming out is contrived because you're working from what you've seen before, what you know from the past, when really creativity comes from the discovery of right now, and trying to express that as immediately and as honestly as possible, and to become more comfortable with being in that space, because it is an uncomfortable space to be in, especially in an acting room where you've got, a classroom of people who are watching you perform this task, right? And it's just, you get that feedback immediately. Yeah. I don't know what.
I just find it fascinating how how it all relates. It doesn't really matter. You're in sculpting, you're drawing, you're painting, you're acting, you're writing. The process relates. And I think what's really interesting about having a conversation with you, Leah, is you're doing a different type of art than say where I focus, but seeing how your process relates to mine and how I do it, but then seeing how you break through paradigms or break through boxes of limitation, I can see how I could apply that to myself, and I think that's kind of where it's really important to listen with an open ear, and to not be so minutely focused on I only look at how other actors act or how other writers write. And maybe your answers are going to come from somebody who does a different art expression than you do entirely, because they're willing to break a paradigm. Whereas for example, in the film industry, there's a lot of things that are this is how you do it. This is how it's done. This is how we do it. This is how we've done it for years. It's but that doesn't necessarily mean that's right. I mean, someone like Marlon Brando comes along and then he does something totally different. And then everyone goes, okay, now this is how we do it. But now everyone's well, this is how we do it. Or Picasso comes along and he does something different, right? Or whoever. But you need to be willing to try to experiment, to be wrong, essentially, so you can find out what's out there. That's kind of what I'm seeing a lot from this conversation is the unconventional ideas are sometimes where you find something new.
Maybe that's also partly shaped by the discipline. So art, the goal of art is often to push past and break conventions or challenge existing notions. And perhaps for the field of film, there's more of an expectation that it needs to fit in a container because of audience expectations. So it makes sense that there would be, of course there's conventions and expectations in art, but it's built into the medium and the discipline, the discipline of art, that it should be experimental, that's its function. So maybe that is, and certainly all of these different disciplines borrow from one another. I mean, art borrows from design and film and fashion, and I think what becomes interesting today, because there's so much art that has happened already, is when they kind of cross over and impact one another, and we get these interdisciplinary practices and outcomes. So I think it would be really interesting to see making a film taking the approach of something that's more a process that's more conventional, let's say, in its unconvention. I don't know if that makes sense, but as an art practice.
No, it's interesting, because with something again, with film, we would look at film and there's a separate section of film where we call it experimental film. It's off in its own corner, but it's not something that's necessarily inbuilt into the discipline or the culture as an expectation of hey, you need to do something different. In fact, very often the expectation in the film industry, particularly, within the mainstream sort of Hollywood studio kind of thing, it's no, you got to check the boxes of, there's less of a space for experimentation. It's not something that's inbuilt into the process. It's you need to deliver a product. And but that's not to say that there aren't filmmakers out there who aren't doing really interesting things and who do push themselves to challenge some of our paradigms of filmmaking.
Yeah. And sorry, I was just going to say sometimes, it's very common for a visit to an art gallery to be a frustrating experience for viewers, because it does break expectations. And maybe we've all experienced experimental films they're somehow frustrating because they don't follow that, satisfying arc of a story that we want to see. Mm-hmm. So I think it's vitally important to experiment and push those boundaries, but also it leans into the possibility of failure a little more. And it might not be satisfying for viewers, but but maybe, I mean, like there's a lot of failures along the way in terms of my own art making because of experimentation, because of like reinventing the wheel each time. And with experimenting, I would imagine with film, you'd also have, more failures. But when you hit on something that's really juicy and compelling, it can be really satisfying. At least that's my experience with art making. But the number of failures required to get there is also quite something.
It's breathtaking.
Yeah, there's a quote. It's like the difference between, I think it's the master and the master has failed more times, right? And I think that's such an important message for people to just take home in anything. It's like your willingness to fail, your willingness to try something new and just experiment is what's going to make you masterful at something. I think there is a like a lot of people, they want to do a good job. They want to get it right. They want to get the approval, the love, the whatever. But, and when you fail or when you make a mistake or when something doesn't work, you don't get that. And so I think it's a chance for everybody to check in and just be honest about, like, do you want to be masterful at this, or do you just want to get like a pat on the back for it? And I think that we're all kind of walking that line a little bit, right? Like there is a point where you want to get patted on the back, maybe you want to make your money from it or you want to make a career out of it. But in the meantime, while you're figuring that out, you got to be willing to make mistakes. You got to be willing to experiment, fail, whatever you call that, to learn and to become better and to explore ground that people who won't fail won't explore. I think. Absolutely.
I totally agree. And being willing to, it's really hard to waste material. I find it really challenging to like waste materials, but, so finding ways to do it in like a safe way that's sustainable and, like not always going to the final materials, although sometimes you need to. I don't know how that would look in film production, but I guess like how to find a way to make these explorations and experiments in a way that is also sustainable. Maybe that's part of the challenge too. So finding materials like making maquettes first and, like finding ways. I guess that's been a challenge for me. I've gone through a lot. I have a heavy footprint in materials that I've recently started lightening and letting go a lot of materials. So and in a way that limits my ability to be really versatile and experimental, but it's, I guess, negotiating how do I make this work in my life in a practical way? But yeah, so maybe there's some of that experimentation can get lost in lightening that, but also, I don't know where I'm going with that exactly, but
well, it seems to me it's one of those things where it's like option paralysis sometimes as well. It's an interesting thing you bring up, just like on a practical level of just like waste of materials or going through materials and just kind of the bizarre creative challenges that we that we never necessarily think of, but then suddenly find ourselves contemplating. But
okay.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say sometimes, no, I was just going to say, it's like, sometimes there is something about being limited, having limited resources that is actually the thing that opens up the creativity. Whereas having like everything that you need and want, and you're just like, I don't even know where to begin with any of this. Whereas like you strip yourself down and suddenly there's a whole world of possibilities that have opened up.
That's a really good point. That's a great point. I know, Brandon, you wanted to say something, but just in response to that, yes, absolutely. So limitation and the creativity that can be found with limited materials. And sometimes it can be overwhelming having, 20 boxes of fabric versus just one box of fabric with which to choose from. It can be paralyzing. So there's definitely a benefit in downsizing and scaling back, and like the freedom that's possible in limitation too. Like I recently moved from my studio apartment to in with my partner and downsized my studio, and now I have this little corner office, which has basically got like a sheet wall to kind of hide it away when I'm not using it in like this funny little fort corner. But there's also like this delight of being in this fort structure that I've built that I didn't necessarily feel when I had this whole expansive space. Now I'm like, okay, I have this little corner and I have this kind of smaller sewing area, but everything that is non-essential can be stripped away. And then maybe a lot of the distractions can go too, and the burden of choice of so many choices as well can be lightened, I'm hoping.
Still figuring that out.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, and like when I was a filmmaker, I still am, but when I was early in my career, how I would collect wardrobe because I was like, well, we could use this for a film, or we might need it, and at one point, like I had all these jackets. I just had a ton of jackets and these like warmers because I'm like, well, I want to be able to make sure everybody's warm when we're shooting outside. And it's like, at a certain point, I'm just like, you got to get rid of these jackets. You know what I mean? Like, cause they're starting to become cumbersome to your life, And I think that, sometimes removing things from your like creative access actually makes you be more creative about how you get access to stuff. So like I became less like making it about me and self-reliant in the sense that I started to expand and ask for help and learn how to raise money and do things that were uncomfortable at first. But because I'm actually like, I can be very introverted, but I pushed myself to be more charismatic and pushed myself to be more out there because for the sake of my art, it's more important that I'm charismatic. It's more important that I'm inclusive. And I think that, you talked a bit about the practicality of art, right? And like, sometimes you have to evolve your artistry more than your materials or more than because they actually support you being small,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a thing that people don't always realize. They think, oh, well, if I just had all the money, if I just had all the things, that would actually that would support all the little quirks that you have that make you small and not expansive as an artist.
Ooh, that's a really good point. I totally relate to that. So like having all of these, stacks and stacks of different types of papers, but then I end up just drawing on, the back of a napkin or, the line paper. So like, if I just had one notebook, then, I could, the freedom in that, like why have so many jackets?
Yeah.
Actually that brings to mind, I'm doing a formal mentorship with an artist in Joshua Tree, California, in the desert of California through the BC Arts Council. They have this wonderful program for artists to work with mentors and specifically for career development. But her practice is based on how to live. That's her fundamental question, is how to live. And through structures that she lives in, like architectural forms and clothing and kitchen kind of structures as well, she explores like, what do we need and how do we take everything away that isn't necessary, so there's just the essential forms to live with. And sometimes she goes too far. Like, for example, she built a table that had only a dip in it so that you could skip the bowl or the plate, just put the food right on the table because of the dip, like pushing those boundaries. But that's been really interesting working with a mentor to kind of remind me. Actually, her like assignments for me was a writing practice to kind of come back to the heart of that inquiry for me. so I've been doing a bit of writing recently, but anyway, that just came to mind in terms of like stripping everything away so that you're free from the burden of the choices, and like, what do we really need?
Mm-hmm. But then taking it away, it also comes with its point of error, right? You take too much away and then you realize what you need to add back. But like, I think, like, for example, I'll just give another example. I went through a period of minimalizing everything in my life, just kind of like get everything out and like, let's only bring back in what I want. And I gave away a blender because I'm like, I never use this fucking thing. And then I also, all of a sudden, I wanted to blend something. And I'm like, damn it, I gave away my blender. And it was like, but here's the thing, I'll use a blender now, but in a weird way, I wasn't using it when I had it and everything else. And so like, I think there's like sometimes you have to kind of remove stuff before you recognize the value of it. And then you can bring it back in, but bring it back in mindfully. And I think as an artist, that's such an important element of the process, is like, there is a part of adding and a part of eliminating, and finding the boundaries. What's too much and what's too little is part of the creative process.
Yeah, that's a good point. So when everything is stripped away, then you can go out and get that specific thing that works for the project, instead of, that other, making it fit into those other materials that weren't going to be as kind of on point.
Totally.
Mm-hmm. We're approaching what our normal sort of runtime is on the show. But I mean, like, I feel like we could just keep on going and talking and talking and talking. But we want to be respectful of your time here. There was one question. This is going back to something you said before, but I really wanted to ask you this question. Do you ever have any of your works come out that reflect something about yourself that surprised you, that you didn't see was there, but suddenly you're just like, oh, I didn't realize that I was putting this into my stuff?
Yeah, I think with that project I did for the city of Richmond, when I stepped back and saw the naivete and innocence of it, I think that was one moment where I was surprised at it, and I couldn't see it in advance. I could only see it once I'd made it, and could step back and look at it as this whole long, I think it was like a year-long project, this long process, and the result did surprise me. And then at that point, I kind of pivoted and changed my approach to focus more on materials themselves and following in a more present way, let's say, following how materials might arrange themselves if I were to just let the materials. And so that led me on this whole other trajectory. It didn't necessarily relate to those utopian structures. And I think certainly an important part of art making of any form is to look at the medium, look at the result, and learn from it. And so then I started on this whole other path of just focusing on materials themselves. And that produced an interesting body of work that I'm now kind of always trying to bridge back to those kind of ideal social sculptures and the materials themselves, and what information they hold that we don't understand necessarily, but like safety pins. I don't know if you saw that piece on the website, but I have one artwork that is 12,000 safety pins on a textile black wool.
I saw that one. Yeah.
The process, that is really about presence, my presence, but it's not about a social interaction necessarily, but that, presence of putting safety pin after safety pin after safety pin for months into this textile was, related more to my tree planting history than these utopian sculptures. But just but absolutely, by looking at the artwork and learning from it, it sent me in a different direction that now kind of adds more complexity and tangents, I guess, to the overall practice.
That's great. Like, it's just, to me, it just speaks to, just this, we continually put out this message, like we talk about like way of the artist, which is like, it's your path. And there's no point in which you just like put your feet up and say, I've arrived, like I've got there. That it's this continual assessing and reassessing and responding, and like, which seems like something we don't want, but creates such a full, rich life when you have that level of engagement of it, as opposed to just trying to reach the plateau where you can just say you're finished, right?
Yeah, like, this is it. I'm just going to make safety pin paintings from here on out because, people responded to them and, someone wants one and, but that would be incredibly boring. So I think in order for it to be interesting and alive for me as a art maker, it has to be a discovery, a continual discovery. Otherwise, I don't think it's as compelling of a kind of pastime or, way of spending time, really.
Mm-hmm.
Well, hey, so we have some questions for you. And these are questions we ask everybody now. Everyone who comes as a guest onto Way of the Artist. So we're gonna kind of fire them at you one after the other, and you can take your time. You can answer them quickly, or you can answer them in more detail and get into why and stuff. But there's some thought-provoking questions. Maybe they'll have you walk away with some interesting thought, but also I think our audience, can kind of start to draw connections between every artist that has their own answers to these. Okay, I'll start with the first one. So, what's the most important book you've ever read?
Ooh, that's a good question. Oh, wow. Most important book I've ever read. Oh, that's a really good question. Okay, I got to take some time with it. It's really hard to narrow it down to one single book, but I'm surprised at the book that came to mind first that impacted me was Jitterbug Perfume by Tom Robbins. I read when I was in my early 20s. And I think this kind of world making and imagination, this sort of like unleashed imagination of the characters that he's created and these worlds that he's built was really kind of exciting for me at the time. And I mean, there have been so many books that I've come across since that have been kind of more related to specifically to art making, but and I've read like probably hundreds of self-help books. None of those came to mind, but this just this kind of world building and imagination is what immediately came to mind.
Excellent.
I'm surprised at that response myself. Okay, go ahead.
So next question is, what film has had the greatest impact on you?
Ooh, I wish I had known these questions in advance. I could have put more thought into it, but okay, just going from the gut, film had the greatest impact on me. I'm thinking about a film. I can't remember the title of it right now. Okay, I love Wes Anderson's films just for their aesthetic delight, but I think films that have had more impact on me have been slower films like Moonlight. What was that? Is that the title of the film that recently?
The Best Picture a couple of years ago?
Yeah. Just the slowness and the visual clarity and that that heartfelt story. Is that the title of the film, Moonlight?
I think that's it. Yeah, Moonlight.
Yeah. And there's a Indian film that I saw again in my 20s about I can't remember I'm sorry, I'm gapping on the title of things, but Moonlight was really powerful in terms of the slowness and that taking the time to tell a story and giving lots of kind of visual space for the characters to unfold. And then on the kind of opposite end of the spectrum, Wes Anderson's more kind of imaginative, colorful, kind of wildly bizarre characters. Yeah.
What I find interesting about your film answer, because I'm so just involved in filmmaking, is just the way in which you focused on in your favorite or the film that made an impact on you. Like, I just think that's such an interesting take on it. Like that's how you perceive film, right? I just find that
visual experience. Yeah,
I find that fascinating, and it's just the pace and stuff like that. Like, it's not necessarily what I personally focus on when I look at a film, but it matters. But I don't necessarily look at it that way. But that's cool. Okay, what's a song that takes you somewhere?
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Just fire the first one that comes to you.
I'm just thinking about things that I've listened to over and over and over and over and over and over and over again that kind of reliably take me to a place of lightness, that are often like music that lifts me up and makes me dance. And I'm thinking, like, the first person that came to mind was a DJ who, mixes other people's music. Neon Steve was the first person that came to mind. It was like an albums that I've listened to over and over and over again, of like whole mishmash of dance music, and then kind of curated into this kind of long track that I've just like listened to over and over and over again over the years. So, actually, as I think about the choices that come to mind immediately, most of them are kind of colorful and imaginative and alive. So, yeah.
Cool. Who's DJ? DJ what was it? Sorry?
Neon Steve.
Oh, Neon Steve. Okay. It sounds a lot like there's another DJ who years ago I somehow accidentally ended up on the stage with him in Los Angeles. He goes by the name.
There's a story.
He goes by the name of Girl Talk. And
Girl Talk.
Yeah, and he does these mashes of like all these like dance songs and stuff like that, and they're just like, one leads into the next, and it's just like they're really fun, and so that just made me think of that. But I'm gonna definitely check this guy out too. All right, your next question: where do you think creativity comes from?
I think for me it comes from kind of an inner child. Like, it relates more to a younger me, and maybe that's because I identified myself as an artist, or I kind of made friends with that idea of the artist as an identity when I was very young. So for me, it comes from a kind of a young place, which helps kind of explain some of the kind of innocence that I see looking back at it. Yeah.
Okay. How do you find inspiration?
I find inspiration from creating the time and space to play with materials. For me, it's a very playful process that most often, it actually is kind of in some ways very childlike. Like, most often involves moving objects around a space. And an artist friend of mine recently described her studio as a 3D sketchbook, and I totally relate to that. So as my studio space as a 3D sketchbook is a way to kind of move materials around and see their proximity, their the way they relate to one another. So it's the permission to play, which is something that sometimes takes more effort to give myself than others. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's really hard, and I'm just like in working mode, so it's hard to give myself the permission to play. But when I do, just give my, like, purely for the process and for the potential discovery, like waiting for the moment of like, yes, this is interesting. This could go somewhere more. So, in terms of like how the materials speak to one another, for lack of a better word. So giving myself permission to play is where I find inspiration.
Mm. What is one thing you would tell your childhood self?
I would say, remember why you're doing this. Like, remember the impulse, like, again, which relates to that permission to play. Like, remember that, because I've forgotten that over the years, and this is really helping me remember that. So it comes and goes, but I would tell my child self to, like, remember, this the delight in that playful process. Yeah.
I love it. That hit me. That hit me right in the feels. Just so you know.
Yeah, I definitely deeply relate to that. I totally get caught into work mode, and like, I'd say the whole reason why I'm a filmmaker is because I used to play. I used to play these games with my friend. And we'd imagine scenarios and we'd act them out, and and that's so much of, like, my toys, my action figures were my like screenplays. They were where I practiced basically telling stories. But when I remember that, it actually does. It gets me excited. It gets me inspired to start doing more of it. Okay, last question.
Awesome.
Yeah. So thanks for that. Okay, last question. What is one thing your future self would tell you right now?
Ooh, what would my future self? Well, sometimes, and I found over the past several years, as I've wanted to kind of shape my life in a particular way to move toward this vision of my future self. I think my future self, because I've been thinking a lot about her over the past several years, I think my future self might say, like, don't forget about this moment. Like, don't forget about now. And that all of those future moments are really take place now. So that's what I think my future self would say to me. That was a great question. Thanks for that one.
Good. That's awesome.
That was the last question. So
yeah, that was the
the
last one. Yeah. It's such a thing that is such a recurring theme for Evan and I as we do this podcast and we have these talks, is like how much the moment right now is just like, it is everything. And I think we can sometimes get so lost in, like, I got to get somewhere and I got to be something and and we forget that that's all happening right now, that this moment is necessary for wherever it is you think you're going. There's no skipping this. This is a part of the journey. You're on it right now, and it's undeniable. So yeah, I think my future self might tell me something similar.
Yeah, that's so good, because I'm totally future oriented. Like, I really am, like, constantly thinking about, like, where am I going? How am I going to get there? Where's this? But really, yeah, that's such a good reminder. Thanks for the question from the future self.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. Well, so we're kind of wrapping this baby up. I mean, this is kind of a moment where we can, if we want, we can kind of say like, I don't know, like what we got out of this, what kind of conclusions, if there's any final thoughts. I don't know if anyone wants to go first, but it's kind of a moment to just maybe wrap it up and say what we got out of it.
Well, I can go, or do you want to go, Evan?
Oh, yeah. You know what? Maybe I'll go, and then maybe we can give you the opportunity to have the last word.
Yeah.
You know what? Like, I'm just first off, I've just really enjoyed this whole talk, and I would definitely love to bring you on again sometime down the road, because I feel like there's so much that we can dive into. But I'm just going to leave it with, sort of how you responded to that. What would you tell your childhood self? Like, just remember that impulse of play. Remember that impulse and that permission that you just sort of used to give yourself to just do it, to just act and jump in. And just so that reminder for me is something that I'm walking away with deeply in this one. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, I'd second that. That's a huge part for me. I think that everything really does come from that childhood self of play. And, play is one of our laws. It's one of the laws we talk about in an episode, and we kind of try to really get into it. And I find that, like, man, when life gets stressful, when I get down, when things aren't working, or when I'm like worked up about whatever, like, if I can just go back to play, it usually solves almost everything. And it takes a certain amount of, like, for me at least, it takes a certain amount of just let go and just let yourself be, with you, and which is kind of like your last question too, which is be in that moment, right? Be in the moment now. And like, anyway, so that lands with me a lot, but I just want to say, like, the one thing that I want to say about the whole talk is thanks so much for trying to come on and articulate things that are almost impossible to articulate, especially with, like, we kind of started, like, we tried to throw you into this conversation and go, like, okay, how does this work? And these things don't have words. And you've really been vulnerable and opened up and tried to share that. And it's definitely enlightened me on my process and helped me to just expand the way that I'm the way that I'm willing to, like, let myself explore my art. And maybe really, I'd say it comes back to the whole thing. It's like, you're giving me more permission to play based on your answers in a way that I would more as a kid. So that's kind of what I'm getting from it.
Oh, I love it. Well, thank you for the opportunity to articulate. It helps me so much to like talk it out and describe it and remember, and giving words to it is really useful for me. And also I'm reminded of play as we talk about this, because it's something that I also forget. And so yeah, I'm taking that. That's my takeaway too. Yeah, that's really great. Like, just remembering to give myself permission to play and trusting that process, like trusting that child self that still is alive in us. Like, perhaps we have all of ourselves, all of our ages, or that core self that has been present the whole time of our I don't even know what to call it, our deeper self maybe, that changes over time too. But anyway, getting into the weeds now, coming back to play. And also, yeah, I just want to say thanks so much for the opportunity. I totally enjoyed it, and I'd love to come back and talk another time.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you got something out of this, if you feel it improved your life or your journey in any way, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, or share the episode.
You can also support us on Patreon, where we have tons of great bonuses. You are the ones that make the show possible and help us to thrive. Thank you for joining us.